Welcome everyone back. This is the fifth session of the Book of the Covenant with Rabbi David Silber, where we will join Rabbi David Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. It's been a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber these past few weeks. And I would like, as I said earlier, I do have some news. This class is going to be extended. Today was supposed to be the fifth and final session. Instead, we will continue picking up on June 15th at this same time, 10 a.m. Eastern on Sundays, and we will continue for 3 more weeks. If you're signed up for this class already, you have the links, you can keep using them to join for the next 3 sessions. Sources for today's class are coming from Exodus 22. If you have your own Tanakh, you're welcome to follow along with that, or you can follow along with the sources on screen posted from Sefaria. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to continue this section over here, namely these laws, Mishpatim, beginning in chapter 21 and extending actually through chapter 23, are all part of what the Torah later calls the Sefer Habrit, the Book of the Covenant. So these are laws that are part of the covenant. And just to be very clear about that, the Aseret HaDibrot, known as the Ten Commandments, as we have spoken, it's not really 10 commandments, but the Aseret HaDibrot are laws, rules, general rules, but they're also part of the covenant. The tablets are called Luchot Habrit, the tablets of the covenant. And we come out of Egypt and we stand at Sinai. So we're entering into a covenant with God. A covenant is a mutual set of obligations. And we have spoken about that. And those are these 10 commandments. But at the end of the 10 commandments, the people said to Moshe, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. We're frightened. We don't want to hear God's voice. And Moshe says, and God says, well, that's fine. Moshe will be the intermediary. God will continue to tell Moshe or teach Moshe the laws, and Moshe will relay these laws to you. And the first larger set of laws, which is the end of chapter 20, 21, 22, 23, in chapter 24, Moshe comes down the mountain and Moshe reads the people, tells the people about the laws. He writes them down and he reads it to the people. It's found in chapter 24. I'll just read you the verse in chapter 24. It says verse number 4. I'll just read it. Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem. Moshe writes all that we're studying now. Moshe writes it down. And then in verse number 7 of chapter 24, the Torah says, Vayikach Sefer Habrit. He took the book of the covenant and he read it to the people. Vayikra b'yoznei ha'am. Because remember that they've never heard this before. The 10 commandments, depending on which interpretation you follow, maybe they heard all 10, maybe they heard 2 of the 10, but they knew something was being conveyed to them. But over here, all of these rules were given to Moshe privately, and Moshe then is going to teach the people. So they never heard this before, and Moshe writes all these things down in what is known as Sefer Habrit, the Book of the Covenant. This is actually incredibly important. And Moshe then turns to the people and he says, he brings a sacrifice. He takes the blood and he throws half on the altar, half on the people. And Moshe says to them, Hinei dam habrit, asher karat Hashem imachem al kol hadvarim wa'ela. This blood of the sacrifice, the blood I threw on the altar, on the people, this blood. And the people had said, Naseh v'nishma, in regarding the Book of the Covenant. And Moshe says, this finalizes the covenant between you and God. This is the blood of the covenant. So what we're studying over here, these laws and these rules are constitutive of the covenant between God and the people. And just to emphasize this point, when you think about a covenant between God and the people, you might think about some lofty concepts. But what's written over here are not lofty concepts. What's written over here are very basic rules about society, about capital crimes, about torts. If my animal gores your animal, if I dig a pit and your animal falls in, as we'll see, This is constituent of the covenants. That's very special and very important to remember at all times. And as Kayla said, I wanted to extend this class three more weeks. I'm going to stop after this class, break for 2 weeks, and I'm adding 3 additional classes. I do think it's important to delve a little more deeply into some of these laws. Of course, we're not going to cover all of them. And each verse of the Torah has an entire world of rabbinic interpretation. And I wanted to touch upon that in this present session. So in the end of the very beginning of chapter 22, and the very last verse of chapter 21 is about theft. The last verse of 21 is Ki ignovi shoroseh utfacho o mecharo. Chamisha bakar yishalem tachat hashor v'arba tzon tachat haseh. So verse number 17 talks about theft. Up to this point, we have in the beginning of Mishpatim kidnapping, that we do have. But here we're talking about theft of an object, in particular, an ox or a sheep. And there's a penalty. If you steal an ox or a sheep, you don't simply restore the value of the object, but there's a penalty. If you either slaughtered it to eat it or you sold it, tivacho or mecharo, 5 times for the ox and 4 times for the sheep. So that's a very important idea, which the Talmud picks up and runs with it, and that is that when it comes to payments, that you have to make for theft, for damages, etc. So the Talmud distinguishes between 2 concepts. One it calls mammon. Mammon means you have to restore what you took. If I damage your property and it costs you $1,000, I have to pay you $1,000. That's called mammon. You're simply replacing the loss. But sometimes we have something else which is called knas, a penalty. And what a penalty means is, first of all, it's not simply restoring what I took. In the case over here, I pay 5 times. I pay 1 plus 4 or 1 plus 3. It's a penalty. And also penalties, another sign of a penalty is where it's a fixed amount. If my ox kills your slave, the Torah says, you pay 30 shekels. And that the Torah doesn't distinguish what kind of slave. It's a penalty. It's not commensurate with the damage. These are 2 very important concepts to remember at all times, especially if you decide to learn or are learning Talmud, you'll come across this, mammon and knas. So in the case of the shor and the seh, it's 5 and 4. I want to emphasize another point over here. These are important things to know in general, and that is that sometimes the Torah often gives examples, gives cases. If a person steals an ox and slaughters it, if a person steals a sheep and slaughters it, what if you steal somebody's donkey and you slaughter it, or you steal a chicken? So the Torah doesn't actually say. And the question is always, when you're reading these laws, the question is always, when the Torah speaks of an ox, for example, is the Torah giving an example, but actually it's any animal? Or is the Torah saying specifically an ox or a lamb, shoroseh? For example, when the Torah speaks in the 10 Commandments of your animals shouldn't work on Shabbat, it may mention sharcha v'chamorecha, your donkey, your ox, but presumably it means any animal. Torah is giving examples. Torah gives you cases or examples, but the rabbinic understanding is to generalize. Sometimes it doesn't generalize, as in the case over here, it's specifically an ox or a lamb or a sheep. So something to keep in mind, but typically it's just giving examples. In any event, we have over here a rule about theft and a punishment of a fine. If you steal an ox or a sheep and you're caught, you don't only restore the object, you pay either 5 or 4 times the amount. Okay, that's the end of chapter 21. And now in chapter 22, as we saw last week, we have another case of theft. We discussed this last week, just to review this very quickly, and that is, if someone is breaking into my house, which literally means someone is breaking or tunneling into my house with the intent to steal, the presumption is there's an intent to steal. And I see the person tunneling into my house and I kill the person. I shoot the person, I kill the person somehow. Ein lo damim. What does ein lo damim mean? He has no blood. It means I'm not responsible for his death. Now, as I mentioned last week, ein lo damim does not necessarily mean I'm allowed to kill him. You wouldn't have to say you're allowed to kill him. What it says is if I did kill him, I'm not held responsible. The Torah actually doesn't explicitly say that you are permitted to kill him. But the rabbinic understanding, and this is, remember, the rabbis are building a system of law. The rabbinic understanding of this law is that if someone is endangering me, if someone is presumed to do something that intends to kill me, let's say, to kill me, then the Torah says I am permitted preemptively to kill him first. Now, the truth of the matter is that from this verse alone, you wouldn't necessarily understand. You would understand that if you did it, perhaps, well, you could understand it many ways. You could understand saying, my home is my castle. If you come into my house, then you risk your life. Not that I necessarily am supposed to kill you, but if you do it, it's going to be on you. But the rabbinic understanding is not that. Apparently, the rabbis were not happy with that understanding. So they presume that the reason you're permitted to kill is because the person actually endangers me. And that is what they call a rodef. That's a very interesting idea because the person hasn't done anything yet. The person hasn't done a thing. Nonetheless, I can preemptively kill him. That's the rabbinic understanding. And the rabbinic understanding is, according to one interpretation, is in verse number 2, but if the sun has risen, im sarcha hashemesh, if the sun has risen, Allah damimro. But if the sun is rising, if he's tunneling at night, and you kill him, you're permitted to kill him. But if the sun has risen, then yesh lo damim, then I'm not allowed to kill him. What is the difference if the sun has risen or the sun has not risen? So one understanding is, if the sun has risen, mean he runs out into the daylight. In other words, he's no longer in the tunnel. He already stole my object. So then, he's walking out of the tunnel. So he poses no threat to my life. He's stolen my money. In that case, I'm not allowed to kill him to get my object back. Have to take him to court. Damim lo. That's one understanding. The only permissibility to kill in the rabbinic thinking is if he actually poses a danger. Then the Torah continues, and this we continue. This we didn't get to last week. In verse number 3, Im himotzei biyado hagneva, mishor ad chamor ad sechayim, shnayim yishaleh. If himotzei, if it is found in his possession, biyado his hand or his possession, if the thing he stole is still in his possession, it could be an ox, it could be a donkey, it could be a sheep. Chayim, that is to say, he hasn't slaughtered it. If he slaughtered the ox and slaughtered the sheep, he pays 5 and 4. But this thief didn't get a chance to do it yet. He's rushing out of the tunnel. He has the sheep in his hand or the ox or whatever, or leading the donkey out, and we catch him with the stolen object in his possession. Then he pays double. He has to restore what he stole, and there's an additional fine. That's known in the rabbinic, in the language of the Talmud, that's called kefel, double. So there's kefel. The thief that's caught pays kefel, and the thief who slaughtered the ox or the sheep pays either 5 or 4 times. Now, there's something else I wanted to point out in terms of the story over here. Maybe this is why machteret, the tunneling, is important. The Talmud distinguishes 2 kinds of thieves. The word over here for thief is the word ganav. See it in Yiddish also, it's a ganav, right? A ganav is a thief. There actually is another kind of thief. Not a ganav, but a gazlan. There's a ganav and a gazlan. Now, what is the difference between a ganav and a gazlan? The answer to that is not as simple as you might think. But let me say in general terms, the difference between a ganav and a gazlan. A ganav steals in stealth. In other words, a ganav sneaks into your house, and when you're not there, maybe you're sleeping or you're not in your house, the ganav takes the object. In other words, the idea of the ganav is to take something when no one can see. That's called a ganav. A gazlan, by contrast, typically is someone who takes by force, like a holdup. He forces you to hand over money or whatever it is. That's called a gazlan. The rabbinic understanding is that all things being equal, the penalty, the fine of paying double or 4 or 5 times, that's for a ganav, but not necessarily for a gazlan. A gazlan just restores the object. The ganav pays the fine, which actually, if you think about it, is actually a very interesting idea. In other words, it would appear that doing something in stealth, doing something where you think no one's gonna see, is worse than simply taking the object, taking it by force. Perhaps because the ganav, it seems to be very concerned about the human being seeing, but much less concerned about God seeing. That's one understanding of it. So the word ganav appears here in this section. Okay, there's a lot more to say about this, to other interpretations if the sun has risen, but just wanted to add a couple of words to what we had talked about last week. Now, before I continue the next little section over here, which is extremely interesting for a number of reasons, and we'll see that. Does anybody have any comments about what we've done so far? If not, we'll just jump right ahead here.
Rabbi Silber, there's some questions in chat. I'm
Right.
just going to share these in chronological order from Susan Lieberman. Does what Moshe wrote down include the Aseret HaDibrot or only the laws of Parshat Mishpatim? When were the Parshiot from Bereshit until now written down? Okay,
so these are very big questions. So according to what Moshe writes down is what is in Mishpatim. The other things are written down on the tablets themselves. The Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the covenant, God said to God initially in the first tablets, it says that the tablets were the tablets of God and the writing is the writing of God. And we'll see this later on. We get to the golden calf story, and we started the golden calf story, but we didn't finish it. But there in the first set of tablets, it's clear that God wrote God's tablets and the writing is God's writing. In the second set of tablets, it's not clear exactly who does the writing and who does the hewing of the tablets, and we'll hopefully get to that someday. Now, in terms of the rest of the Torah, the rabbinic Rashi makes it clear, or at least Rashi, that that has all been written down already. Who wrote the Torah? That's the question. So we're not going to get into that now because that's not really our topic. But let's say one view, I think the traditional view, is that Moshe wrote it. Whether Moshe wrote it because God dictates it word for word, that's one view, or whether Moshe writes it, he sort of has somewhat of a free hand to write it, that God told him things in general, and Moshe writes the Torah and has sort of a free hand. That is the view of the Rashbam, I think, and the Rashbam circle of the Pashtanim, the Tosafistic Pashtanim, the time of the Rashbam. They seem to suggest that. I just came across that the other day, but that's another big question. That's an interesting question, because the Torah itself doesn't tell us who wrote the Torah. At certain points, God said to Moshe, write this down. But the Torah itself never says that Moshe wrote the whole Torah, never says it at all. So that's the whole question. To whom do we ascribe the authorship of the Torah? Certainly one view to an accepted view is that it's all Torah Moshe, but the Torah never said that. That's a rabbinic understanding.
And
Any
there's
other
another
questions?
question in chat
Yeah.
from Debbie Sondheim. Quote, what is the logic in thinking that the robber would not fight to protect what he has stolen?
No, the logic is that if someone's breaking into here's the logic. This is Talmudic logic. As I mentioned multiple times, in my view, the plain reading of the text it's not saying this. But here's the rabbinic understanding is the following. The rabbis, I would say the following, again, in my opinion, the rabbis were unhappy with the idea that if somebody breaks into my house, that sort of my house is my castle, and you have no permission, you come with ill intentions into my house, intending to steal something, I have the right to actually kill you. That the rabbis don't want to accept. Therefore, the rabbis convert this little parsha over here into a case of a potential murderer. And their point is the following, which is a very interesting point. Someone's breaking into my house. I hear someone opening the door. I know it's a robber. But here's the point. I could go back to my room, close the door, pretend I'm asleep, let the robber steal whatever he wants to steal, and that's it. He walks out the door, I lock the door, and I say, whatever. So he stole my property, but he didn't harm anybody. Who says he has an intention to harm anybody? I'll just shut my door, lock my door, stay inside, he'll take what he wants, and he'll leave. The Gemara, though, says the following. The Gemara says that the robber who's coming in figures, if he sees me, there's a good chance people are not going to simply sit back and let me steal. They're going to confront me. They may even try to harm me. Therefore, the robber who enters the house comes with intention of, if they're going to start up with me, I might have to kill them. And since the robber comes with that intention, that in turn gives me permission to kill the robber, because the robber is then seen as somebody who potentially comes to kill me. That's the rabbinic understanding. And the rabbis amplify that. The rabbis say, for example, when the Torah says, if the sun has risen, you're not allowed to kill the robber. The midrashic understanding of that is, you say, we have an expression in English, it is clear as day, right? We have that expression, it's clear as day. What the rabbis read into this verse, it's clear as day. In other words, if you know that the robber is not going to kill you, then you're not allowed to kill the robber. The example that the Gemara gives about a robber who's not going to kill you is when a father steals from his child. The father's a robber. The father breaks into his kid's house. The Gemara says the child is not allowed to kill the robber in that case, because parents are not going to kill their children. That's what the Gemara says. But the reverse is not true. If the kid's breaking into the father's house, the parent's house, then the parent is permitted to kill because the kid would kill his father. That's what the Gemara says, which is an interesting observation. But the point that I'm making is that the rabbinic tradition converts the Machteret story into a case of Rodef. That's my point. And my additional point is, apparently, they were not happy with the plain understanding that if someone comes into my house and I didn't invite them in, and they have ill intentions, just to rob me, not going to harm me. Nonetheless, I don't care. I'm allowed to kill them, which you do have in some of the other codes of the ancient Near East. I forget which code. It might be in Hammurabi, it might be a Shnuna, but I saw it explicitly. Someone comes to rob you, you're allowed to kill them. But the rabbinic tradition doesn't like that, and therefore they choose to interpret this text differently. That's the point I'm making over here. I mean, the larger point is, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, and what's interesting, when you begin to read these things, and you're familiar with the mounds and mounds of rabbinic interpretation, and you go back to the verses and you ask yourself the question, what does it actually say? That very often we have to wonder where the rabbis get their interpretations from, because the plain meaning of the text seems to be very different. And I now want to get into a very interesting rule, which the commentaries on the Torah were actually bothered by. There's a rabbinic interpretation, but the Rashbam who says explicitly in his introduction to all this, what the Talmud says, what the halachos are, they're central to us. I'm here just to say what it says in the Torah. And what it says in the Torah, the Rashbam intimates, is very different from what the rabbis claim it says in the Torah. In any event, we will see this right now. So let's just skip for a moment verse number 4 and verse number 5. We will come back to that. But as I mentioned multiple times, in Parshat Mishpatim and other Parshiot as well of law, it's a very strange thing. It's like A, B, A. We just finished talking about theft. Theft if you catch the thief with the object, you pay double. If you slaughter the ox or the sheep, you pay 4 and 5 times. Under certain conditions, the robber is considered to be a danger, etc. Once the robber is no longer a danger, then you have to take him to court. You take him to court. You're not allowed to run after him and kill him. Can't do that anymore because he posed no danger to you anymore. He's walking away with the out. He's already stolen. Fine. So we're going to skip now verses 4 and 5. We're going to pick up in verse number 6. 6 and 7, up to and including verse 12. Well, let's begin with verse number 6. The following. Ki yitain ish el re'ehu, kesef o kelim lishmar, v'gunav mi beito ish. Im yimotzei haganav yishalem shnayim. So we have a case over here. What is this rule about? We have in Hammurabi as well. Somebody gives someone else an object to watch. It's called the shomer. We have the rule of the shomer. So someone gave his friend either money or vessels to watch. Right? I have some money. Watch the money for me. Here's $1,000. Hey, watch the money. Or I give you some vessels, some kalim, any kind. It doesn't matter what kind. Please watch it for me. And what happened? It was stolen. The money was stolen. The vessels were stolen. If you catch the thief, then what's the rule? Someone who steals and you catch the thief with the object, what's the rule? We had it before in verse number 6. Sorry, verse number 3. If you find the object with the thief, you pay double. Kefil, right? That's verse number 3. So over here also, it's not in my house. I give it to you to watch. You're watching my object. The object was stolen from you, but it's my object, right? It's stolen from the guy's house, but not the one who gives the object, the one who's watching the object. Someone stole it, you pay double. What about imlo yimotzei haganav? If you don't catch the thief, v'nikrav bal habayit el Elohim. The Baal Habayit is who? Baal Habayit is in this description. It's the shomer. It's the watcher. In other words, I gave you $1,000. I watch this thing for 30 days for me. I come back after 30 days. Okay, give me my money. And the guardian says, the shomer says, it's stolen. The money was stolen. By whom? I don't know. It was stolen. Then what happens in that case? Then the shomer, the Baal Habayit's shomer, comes close to God. Im is often in conjunction with an oath. It's the language of an oath. In other words, the rabbinic understanding is that the watcher, you're watching my object, that the watcher swears that it was stolen. The watcher swears that it was stolen, right? That's the rabbinic understanding. The watcher swears that it was stolen, and then, right? He didn't steal it himself, it was stolen, right? In that case, presumably, V'nikrav bal habayis el Elohim draws near to God. The rabbinic understanding means you take an oath. You take, because an oath is in God's name. That's the rabbinic understanding. You swear. It's known in the Gemara's Shvuat HaShomrim. It's the oath that a watcher takes, that a shomer takes. What does he swear? He swears it was stolen. Fine. And what happens when he swears it was stolen? What happens? Presumably, he then doesn't pay. That's the understanding of the Talmud. If the shomer swears it was stolen, it was really stolen. I didn't steal it. It was stolen by somebody else. Then the Torah says, according to the rabbinic understanding, you don't pay. That's verse number 7. Then in verse number 8, which is a very difficult verse, it says the following: I'll call devar pesha, I'll shor, I'll chamar, I'll seh, I'll samar, I'll kol avedah, asher yomar ki uzeh, ad Elohim yavod dvar shnehem, asher yashiyun Elohim yishalem shnayim l're'ehu. Let us bracket for the moment verse number 8, because the rabbinic understanding of verse number 8, which appears, I would say, to be very far from what the Torah seems to be saying, but according to the rabbinic understanding of verse number 8, is a very, very important concept, which the Talmud deals with in several places. And we'll come back to verse number 8. We'll come back to it. Let's get now to verse number 9, though. Ki yitain ish el re'ehu chamor o shor o seh v'chol behemah lishmar. We go back now, again, another case of a watcher, a shomer. But in this case, I didn't give you money or vessels to watch. I gave you an animal. Chamor, shor, oseh, v'chol behemah. Here it says any animal. Doesn't matter what animal. Umeit, o nishbar, o nishba, ein roeh. What happened to the animal? The animal died, or the animal was injured, or the animal nishba was captured. Chevy was captured. It's missing. Either it's dead, or it was taken by some marauding army, nishba, right? Or it's wounded. And so I gave you an animal, a nice animal, $1,000 animal. I come back and I see the animal's dead. Well, the animal was the animal. The army came by and marauders came by, and they broke its leg or they captured it. Then the Torah says, Shvuat Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem, im lo sholach yado b'mlechet re'ehu, v'lakach bi'olav v'lo yishalem. What happens in this case? Here the Torah says explicitly, an oath. God's oath is between them, between me, who gave the object, it's called the mafkid, and the shomer, and the watcher. So I swear, what do I swear? I swear that it was broken, that it was injured, that it died of natural causes. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't kill it. In that case, the owner of the object, that's me in this case, accepts the oath. And the shomer does not pay. But it was stolen. In other words, if it in fact was stolen, I claim that it's not stolen. I claim that it wasn't stolen. I claim it was injured in some kind of a marauding army, or it died of natural causes, or whatever. I don't say it was stolen. It wasn't stolen. Then if I swear to that, I'm believed. But the rabbinic understanding is, however, im ganovi ganev, but if in fact it was stolen, where's my cow? Your cow was stolen. Oh, it was stolen. Yishalem livalav, then the watcher has to pay. Okay? If something else happened to it, next verse, im torofi torev, if it was torn up, right? If it was torn by beasts, Yiviehu aid. I have to demonstrate some kind of a proof. If I can demonstrate that it was torn by wild animals, hatrefa lo yishalem. I don't have to pay for the injury. So in other words, what does the Torah seem to say? Let's summarize what the Torah says, then we'll see the problem. It says here, beginning in verse number 9, if I'm watching an object, an animal, that's the case they give, is an animal, right? An ox, a donkey, whatever. And you say, where's my animal? I say, well, the animal was an act of God. An accident took place, a marauding army took place, or it just died of natural causes. Then I swear to that, and I don't pay. But if it was stolen, I do pay. What's the problem? What is the problem here? This is the rabbinic understanding. What is the problem? Very simple problem. The problem is, you see the problem? The problem is that in this second section over here, it says, if I'm watching an object and it gets stolen, I got to pay. Where's my object? It was stolen. Okay, it was stolen. You have to reimburse me. The ox was worth what? $1,000? Okay, it was stolen. Give me $1,000. If we find the guy who stole it, then we'll take it back from them. I'll give you back your $1,000. But meanwhile, if it was stolen, don't find the guy, you pay for theft. A guardian, a watcher, pays if it's stolen. But according to the rabbinic understanding of the previous verses, verse number 7, right? There it says what? If the object was stolen, if you find the thief pays. But if you don't find the thief, then the watcher goes before God, and the rabbinic understanding is swears and doesn't pay. In other words, according to the first section over here, beginning in verse number 6, someone who's watching an object and the object is stolen does not pay. I don't have to pay you back if it was stolen. If I stole it, that's another story. If I was negligent, that's another story. But if it was stolen, I don't pay. Whereas in the second section, beginning in verse number 9, there the Torah seems to say, according to the rabbinic reading of the text, that if the object was stolen, you do pay. It's a contradiction. The rabbinic understanding of these verses is an internal contradiction, and a rather serious one. Does a watcher pay for an object that they watch and the object was stolen? Does everybody see the problem here? So what is the rabbinic solution to this problem? Does anybody know what the rabbinic solution to the problem is? And we'll see in a moment that the Ramban, the Rashbam, and my friend who wrote a long essay about this, which I think is excellent, I don't want to tell you what he says, they address this problem. But what is the rabbinic solution? Does anybody know what the rabbinic solution is? Nobody. I'll tell you what it is. The rabbinic solution is that the two different paragraphs deal with two different kinds of watchers. That the first paragraph deals with somebody who does a favor to the other guy. You come to my house, I'm going away for a couple of weeks. I have these animals. I have the stuff or money, whatever, it doesn't matter. Can you wash it for me? Yeah, be neighborly. I say, okay. So I'm watching it, and then the object was stolen. Come back 2 weeks later, where's the object? Sorry, it was stolen. And that really? Then you swear it was stolen, and you don't pay. That's the first parsha. But the second parsha is a different case, where you come to me and say, will you watch my objects for me? I'll be happy to watch your objects for you, no problem. It's $100 a day plus expenses. That's my business. It's called the Shomer Sachar. I'm paid for watching. If you're paid for watching, then you assume the responsibility that if it's stolen, you have to reimburse. That is the rabbinic solution, and the Talmud that deals in more than one place with the rules of the watchers, the rules of the Shomrim, distinguishes between what's called the Shomer Chinam and the Shomer Sachar. Okay? What is the problem with this? What is the problem with this distinction? The problem with the distinction is not a logical problem. It's a very simple problem when it was studying the Chumash, that there seems to be no intimation whatsoever that the Torah distinguishes between a watcher who's paid and a watcher who is not paid. It doesn't say that he's paid. It says nothing of the sort. So first of all, where did the rabbis get this from altogether? And secondly, what is the Pshuto Shel Mikvah? So does anybody want to suggest what is the difference between the rule that begins in verse number 6 and the rule that begins in verse number 9? What is the difference between them? Well, when you read one clear difference is, and the main difference seems to be, what did I give the watcher to watch, right? In verse number 6, if you give your friend money or vessels. But in verse number 9, if you give your friend an animal, chamor, oshar, oseh, v'chol behemah lishmar. So the Rashbam and the Ramban distinguish between the two paragraphs on this basis. The Rashbam says, I'm not out to defend the rabbinic tradition. I want to understand the Chumash. The Ramban is always wants to do both. He wants to defend the rabbinic tradition, but he also believes in understanding the plain meaning of the Chumash. Says the Rashbam, Kesev okelim lishmar. Okay? The Rashbam says, if you give somebody money to watch or vessels to watch, here's a couple of jars of mine, a couple of nice glasses. So what's the person going to do? The person presumably is going to take that money and put it in a drawer in his house. The person has his own money. The person is going to watch it. People watch their own money. People are careful with their own money. And the assumption is, whatever you do with your money, please do with my money. And there is no particular, it's not a tough job to do. In other words, the assumption is, I give you the money to watch the same way you watch your own money. So you take precautions about your own money to a certain extent. Someone breaks into my house, I lost my money. So the assumption is that you're going to watch my money the way you watch your money. You're not going to do anything special, because you don't really do anything. You just put it in the drawer, you shut the drawer, and that's the end of that. But when it comes to the second parsha, where you give someone an animal, you don't put the animal inside your drawer. The animal has to be taken out. The animal can walk around. The animal it could be grabbed by somebody. In other words, when I assume responsibility for the animal, I'm by definition assuming responsibility beyond just putting it in my drawer, because animals walk all about. So you agree to watch my animal that's wandering across the fields. You can't come and say someone snatched the animal, because you should watch the animal. Animals can be snatched. Animals here, and in 1 hour from now, they can be 10 miles away. So you have to watch more. So in that case, your failure, in that case, the geneva is actually kind of negligence, because that's what animals do. That's what the Rashbam basically says. The Ramban goes one step beyond, and the Ramban says, and that's the basis, says the Ramban, for the Talmudic distinction between a paid watcher and a non-paid watcher. Because the Ramban says, because since in the case of the first case, I give you money, you have a drawer full of money, you put my money in a little package in the same drawer, and you don't do anything else. Well, you do nothing else. It's inside your house. You don't have to do anything. So therefore, in that case, the Talmud says, listen, do the guy a favor. Why should I take money? I'm not really doing anything. I put it inside my drawer, the same way my money's in the drawer. When it comes to animals, says the Ramban, it's a lot of work. You have to walk them out, It's like someone gives you the dog to watch. That's exactly the same thing. You take the dog out, you walk with the dog, etc., etc. So it's not necessarily assumed you would do that for nothing. It's actually a job. So therefore, the rabbinic understanding of the second parsha, namely, the rabbinic understanding, says the Ramban, is that in that case, it's actually talking about someone who's paid to watch. And when you're paid to watch, you assume more responsibilities. It's actually, I just want to mention something which is not directly related to what it says in the Chumash, but it's actually a very interesting idea that was advanced by the Balei HaTosfot. So it's a small digression, but just bear with me, and a very interesting digression. The Tosafos, where we study Talmud, typical page of Talmud, there's Rashi on one side, and the Balei HaTosfot on the other. And what the Tosafos do, actually, they create the great revolution in learning. The Tosafos work with the assumption that all Talmudic texts have to be reconciled. Can you imagine this? You have thousands of pages. Not only what it says, but even the kind of implicit assumptions of the text have to be reconciled. It's mind-boggling. So the Talmud has a whole question. We're talking over here if the watcher fails to watch, or we have cases where animals damaged. The Talmud distinguishes, and maybe we'll come to this when we come back for 3 extra weeks. The Talmud distinguishes between my animal damaging and me damaging. If my animal damages, fundamentally, what makes me responsible is the obligation to watch my own animals. People have an obligation to take care of their property and to make sure that my property doesn't damage somebody else. We'll get to this hopefully today. When it comes to a person damaging, the Mishnah has very famously 3 words: Adam mu'ad li'olam. A person is always responsible for damage, which seems to say that whether or not you were negligent, you pay. That's what the Mishnah seems to say. Adam, I'm walking down the street, and so all of a sudden, some terrible wind came across, 80-mile-an-hour wind. It picks me up and slams me into somebody else or someone's property, and the person is damaged, the property is damaged. So the Ramban says, you pay. It's not my fault, doesn't matter. People are always responsible for what they do. That's what the Mishnah seems to say, and that's how many of the commentaries understand the Mishnah. But the Tosafos didn't like it, because the Tosafos found other places in the Talmud which suggests that under those circumstances, you don't have to pay, because it's totally not your fault. And what's interesting is that the Tosafos create a new concept, actually, an amazing one, which is, they say the following. When the Mishnah says, if you give an object for somebody to watch, if you don't pay them, it's a shomer chinam, according to the rabbinic understanding, that's verse number 6. You gave them money or vessels to watch, and you didn't pay them. They're only responsible for negligence. But if I paid the watcher, which according to the rabbinic understanding is verse number 9, if I paid them, then they're responsible for more than negligence. They are responsible if the object got lost or if it was stolen. Now, what the Tosafos do, remarkably, is they say there are 3 different things. There's negligence, then there's lost or stolen. And the Tosafos say lost and stolen are not the same thing, because stolen is unusual. Stolen is not negligence. I watched it, but it got stolen. The thieves are very clever. But it got lost. That's a very vague concept. It somewhat hovers in between stolen and negligence. And the Tosafos developed this entire elaborate system in which they say that if a person damages another person, if it's negligence or akin to something being lost, then you pay. But if it's akin to being stolen, then you don't pay. The Tosafos took this concept of the watcher and expanded it to cover the cases where people damage other people. It's not really my fault. I wasn't really negligent. The Mishnah says you pay, but the Tosafos say it depends under what circumstance. If it's really not my fault at all, I don't have to pay. If it's somewhat my fault, akin to an object getting lost, not exactly negligence, the Talmud distinguishes, but it's not theft either. I'm just pointing out, it's very interesting how the Tosafos work. Now they take this parsha over here, which never mentions getting paid and not getting paid, by the way. They take this parsha and they expand it to cover all kinds of cases, including the very interesting case of a person that damages. Maybe we'll discuss this next time we meet. There's so much to do over here. Fine. Now I mentioned that my friend has an article that he wrote about this section. And his interest is, as the Rashbam will say, what does the Torah actually say here? Let's leaving out the rabbinic understanding, which does not seem to be the plain meaning of the text at all. So here's what he suggests. I must say that I find it personally pretty convincing. What he says is this. He says the parsha that starts in verse number 6 and the section that starts in verse number 9 are addressing 2 completely different things. Verse number 6, right? That's how we started. Ki yitain ish el re'ehu kesef o kelim l'shmar v'gunam mibeito ish im yimotzei haganav yishalem shnayim. So verse number 6 takes you back to verse number 3. We started today with theft. Verse number 6 says, a thief pays double, right? Before we had, in verse number 3, if you find in the possession of the thief an animal, an ox, a donkey, a sheep, you pay double. In verse number 6, it says, it's true of any object. If you steal money or you steal vessels, you steal whatever it is, if you find the thief pays double. But in verse number 6, it's talking about money or vessels that you entrusted to a watcher. And verse number 7 says the following: suppose you don't find the thief. Okay, I gave you $1,000. I come for my $1,000, and you say we stole it. Really? Okay, you issue a report, the police are searching around. Where's the thief? Answer: I don't know. We can't find the thief. Then, under such circumstances, there's two possibilities. Money doesn't just disappear, okay? One possibility is it was stolen and we didn't catch the thief. And the other possibility is that the watcher, the shomer, is in fact the thief. Because it's not the same as an animal. Because an animal is pretty hard to steal an animal. Animals walk around. So you can't just steal an animal because it's going to be walking around, you recognize your animal, etc. But money or vessels that in someone's house, it's pretty easy for somebody to take that money. So in this case, this is the claim he makes. In this case, we suspect the watcher. We don't know that he stole, but we suspect him. And therefore, under such circumstances, how can you prove it? You can't really prove it. So in that case, if you don't find the thief, now we have to pay careful attention to the words over here in verse number 7. The rabbinic understanding of verse number 7 is the watcher, in this case called the Baal HaBayit, should draw near to God. The rabbinic understanding of drawing near to God is to take an oath, right? You swear. That's the rabbinic understanding. You swear you didn't steal it, and then you don't have to pay. If it turns out that you actually did steal it, you pay double. Fine. But the point is that many, certainly the moderns, say if Nikrav Baal HaBayit El HaElohim means to take an oath, then why did the Torah say you take an oath? As it does, for example, in verse number 10. Shuat Hashem yeh ben shnehem im lo sholach yado b'mlechet re'ehu. Right? In the second section that we saw beginning in verse number 9, right? The person claims it was stolen away by some marauding army or whatever, then you swear to it. You take a shvur, you take an oath. Why, when the Torah speaks in verse number 7, does it have the expression you draw near to God? Right. So the suggestion that many moderns make, and my friend as well, is that verse number 7, the pshat of the Chumash, is not an oath. Were it an oath, it would have said shvua, as it says in other places. We have many times the word oath appears in the Bible and in the Torah. This is something else. This is the case where you suspect somebody. You suspect him, but there's no way to know. How are you going to prove one way or the other? So in this case, the claim is drawing near to God does not mean taking an oath. It means something different. Either it means some kind of an oracle, or if you think about it, actually, the Talmud does have such a concept, which is called the Urim V'Tumim, right? The priest, the high priest, had in his breastplate what's called the Urim V'Tumim. Somehow you can inquire of the God through the Urim V'Tumim. We have, for example, in the book of Shmuel, on several occasions, somebody inquires of God. So in this case, V'nikrav Baal HaBayit El Elohim would mean you inquire of God in the sense that God will tell you whether the guy stole it or not. But let's say the guy did not steal it. let's say the somehow you get this message from God through a prophet, Urim V'Tumim, whatever. And the message is, and this is the important point. No, the guy didn't steal it. But here's the point. In this interpretation, it never suggests that the shomer doesn't pay. The Torah doesn't deal with, his point is why I like it. The Torah does not distinguish between a paid watcher and non-paid watcher. That's a rabbinic reading into the text. That's the Ramban's cleverness. Well, for an ox, you usually pay. For money, you wouldn't pay. But the Torah never says that. His point is that verse number 6 and 7 are not dealing with payment at all. They're dealing with something else. They're dealing with ganov. It's an extension of what we have above. What about a case where you suspect somebody's a thief, but there's no proof? As over here, you gave someone some money, and you come back a month later, where's the money? It was stolen. Oh, really? So cool. I don't know, stolen someone. Investigation, can't find anybody. So naturally, in that case, we do suspect that the guy that you gave the money to, maybe it's somebody you know, maybe you thought you knew. So in that case, the point is, the issue is he a thief or not? If he's a thief, he pays double. But let's say he's not a thief. Let's say someone else did steal it. But the Torah never says you don't pay in that case. You do pay. You restore the object. If you gave me $1,000, I give him back $1,000. If he's the thief, I give him $2,000 because the thief pays double. Okay? That's the suggestion that my friend makes. And it's interesting because his point is to distinguish between two different things. One might say between criminal law and between torts. Verse number 6 and 7 deal with criminal law. Is the man a thief or not a thief? And his point is that actually, this is a strong point. If you look at verse number 3, we started before, you notice that the language over here of verse 6 and verse 7 reminds us of the language earlier about the thief. For example, in verse number 3, and here you have in verse number 6 and 7. It's the same kind of language. And as I mentioned earlier, the structure, for whatever reason, of these rules is ABA. So thief, then there's a break on verses 4 and 5, and then you get once back to thief. 6 and 7 deal with, is the guy a thief or not? It does not discuss the payment. If he approaches God and God says, not a thief, then what? Okay, he's not a thief, but he's still a negligent watcher. He still has to reimburse me, as it said later on. You reimburse. If it's an accident, an act of God, an accident, a marauding band, then you don't pay. But for regular theft, you do pay. That's the responsibility you take on as a watcher. The rabbinic understanding is very different, and they distinguish between a shomer chinam and a shomer sachar. And the second point is he distinguishes between the expression to approach God and to take an oath. Personally, I'm convinced by it. I just wanted to put it out there. I thought it was interesting. Okay, now before we still have a good 15 minutes, and I did want to go back to the verses that we skipped, and then if we have time, I wanted to discuss verse number 8, which we skipped over, verse number 8. But let me first discuss verse number 4 and 5, then I'll stop and take comments and questions. Verse number 4 and 5 is a extraordinarily interesting two verses, especially those who learn Talmud, actually. If you really, when you start to read the psukim, because when you learn Gemara, you sort of assume that what the Gemara says about the Torah is pshat. Then you open up the Chumash and you say, 1 second, is the Torah really saying that? And here we have a great classic example. I didn't discover this. I mean, I discovered it, but it's not me. And this is an interesting question. Verse 4 and verse 5. Let's take a look at this. It says the following. Ki yaver ish sodeh okerem. V'shilachet bi'iro u'bi'er b'stei acher. Meitav sodehu u'meitav kamo yishalem. The translation we have over here is, when a man lets his livestock loose to graze in another's land, allows a field or a vineyard to be grazed bare, he must make restitution for the impairment of that field or vineyard. In other words, they're interpreting, the Hebrew is Yaver ish sadeh kerem, v'shilachet bi'iro u'bi'er b'stei acher. 3 times we have the Hebrew word bet, ayin, resh. A bi'ir can be an animal. Bi'iro can be an animal. So the understanding of the JPS, and it follows the rabbinic understanding. If a person let loose, Yaver ish sadeh kerem. What does the word Yaver mean? What does bo'er mean? Havara.
Burn.
Burn, right. Havara is to burn. But the understanding over here, but the word to burn, all right, can also mean to consume. The word consume, right, in English can mean something is consumed by fire. Also consume when you
eat up.
When you eat it up. The rabbinic understanding is I have a be'ir, I have an animal that eats, I have my ox. What did I do? I sent my animal into someone else's field, and the animal ate the other guy's field. In that case, I have to pay, I have to restore the lost crop by giving meitav sadeyu or meitav karmo yishalem. The question is, you have to pay either your best or you have to pay the other person's best. That's a ready discussion in the Talmud. But there's a payment to be made to restore the field that my animal grazed in your field. I have no right to send my animal to your field to graze. I have to pay it back. That's the understanding. In the Talmud speaks about a damage they call shame. They call it tooth. What does tooth mean? Tooth means my animal is eating up your field. So the Talmud in Bava Kama discusses the definition of what it means, of what's shame. But shame is the way in which animals can damage. Animals eat. It's normal for animals to eat, but not in your field. Not in your field. Fine. The Talmud also assumes that the animal has to pay for trampling your field. It's called regel. Shame v'regel. The animal pays for shame v'regel, and this is the verse. I sent my animal into your field and it ate. So it trampled your crops and it ate your crops. In that case, I have to pay from the best, either my best or your best, but I have to make restitution. That's the rabbinic understanding, the primary rabbinic understanding. There is another understanding I'll get to in a minute. That's the primary rabbinic understanding of verse number 4. And now we come to verse number 5. Ki teitzei eish, umatzah kotzim, v'ne'echal gadish o akama o asadeh, shalem yishalem hamavir et habe'era. This says when a fire is started, a fire literally goes out. When a fire goes out, and it spread to thorns, and from the thorns it spread up to stacked wheat, standing wheat, or growing grain, right? It's consumed. He who started the fire, hamavir, the one who started the fire, shall pay for habe'era, for the fire. So this is what the Talmud says, the damage that they call this eish. This is eish. So verse number 5 is the animal that consumes. They call that either tooth or foot, shein and regel. You pay the full amount that you damaged from the best of your crop. And in verse number 5, it talks about a fire that left my domain, it went into your domain, it burnt up maybe your crops or whatever. Then hamavir et habe'era, the one who started the fire, has to pay for that which was consumed for the fire. That's the classic rabbinic understanding of the two verses. What is curious, obviously, is that the same verb, the same word appears in both sections. Bet, ayin, resh. And in the first section, it's referring to the animal that eats, right? Appears 3 times the word Yaberi Sadeo Kerem, Shilach Bi'iro Ubi'er B'stei Acher. And then in verse number 5, Shalem Yishalem Hamavir Et HaBe'era. So we have 2 more times the word Be'era. So there is an alternative way to read it, which is found in actually, it's found in one of the not so well-known interpreters of Bible, 13th century, or the Balei Tosfot, and Kasher, in his Torah Shlema, finds within the early rabbinic tradition this possibility. And the possibility is this, that both verse number 4 and verse number 5 refer to fire. But they refer to fire in two different ways, right? The word bi'ur, right? The word bi'ur. We have it, bi'ur chametz, right? We talk about bi'ur chametz. Now that's rabbinic language. The Torah never spoke about bi'ur chametz. The Torah spoke about destroying the chametz, tashbitu. But the point is, if you assume that both refer to fire, then it's saying something else. It should be read this way. Actually, my brother suggested that is a general proposition. If someone burned up a field, I burned up your field, and this could happen in two different ways. One is, one is I set the fire out. In other words, I purposely lit a fire, and it burnt your field. I sent my fire out, and it burnt the field. If I sent it out, then I paid the best. That's one case. That's case number one. Now we get to case number two. Not where I sent it out, but the fire went out. I had no intention to send the fire out. I lighted fire, and you know what? There are a bunch of thorns at the edge of my property, and it catches on the thorns. And from the thorns, the fire spreads, and it goes into your field, and it burns up your stacked wheat or whatever. In that case, you pay for the damages, but not for the best. So the Torah distinguishes two kinds of fire damages. One is, which is basically intentional. I actually intend to damage you. Then not only do I restore, I got to pay my best. If I have better crops than you, it doesn't matter. You get my best crops. It's one way to read it. My best crops, or I pay for your best crops. Now, the same amount of money, but higher quality. That's if I sent it out. But if it went out by itself, that's a case of negligence. I didn't mean to harm anybody. In fact, it just so happened that I wasn't careful. There were thorns at the edge of my property, and the thorns got all on fire, and fire spread. Then, shalem yishalem hamavir et habeira. What's very interesting is, first of all, I will confess, I have absolutely no idea which is the better interpretation. I think they're both possible. My instincts are that the second way is probably closer to the pshat. But who knows? But the idea of bi'ur is actually very, very, the term bi'ur, I can't get into this now, it comes up in multiple contexts, multiple rabbinic contexts. The one that's most obvious to us is chametz, right? We search for the chametz at night, the night before Pesach, b'dikat chametz, and we make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. When we're searching, you make a blessing. Sheikh Hashem mitzotav tzivanu al bi'ur chametz. The blessing is al bi'ur chametz. So, but we're not burning any chametz at that point. So, what does al bi'ur chametz mean? Does al bi'ur chametz mean that we're making it now with the intention that what we're going to find, we're going to burn? Ain't bi'ur chametz el sreifa? Or do we say no? Bi'ur doesn't mean sreifa. Bi'ur means tashbitu. You have to get rid of it. If you want to burn it, you can burn it. If you want to throw it in the ocean, you can throw it into the ocean. That's a question in the Talmud, actually. What bi'ur? Does bi'ur mean just to consume it or to get rid of it? You know, the Baal HaMaor famously says, if you eat chametz erev Pesach, you fulfill the mitzvah of bi'ur chametz. You consumed it, literally consumed it. So you did a mitzvah. You mitzvah bi'ur chametz. So does it mean to burn? And here you actually, it's an interesting question. Does it mean the animal that consumes? The bi'iro is my animal that consumes? Or is bi'iro my fire? I think that the larger project over here, what's very important, I think, is that we, especially if you learn Talmud, because it's very easy to fall into this trap of thinking that what the Gemara says is what the Chumash seems to say, as opposed to saying the Gemara is interpreting in some way or constructing a system, but that's not actually what it says in the Chumash. The Pshuto Shem Mikra is something very different. Now, let me stop here and take comments or questions. I didn't address verse number 8, which is a rather remarkable verse, but maybe next time. We meet again in 2 weeks, and again, there's so much here, but I like to pick out other of these rules and laws that are particularly interesting, I think, and really say something about, speak to the way the rabbinic tradition, the Torah Shebaal Peh, is reading these verses, and to point out what it actually seems to say before we get to the rabbinic interpretation. Okay, let me stop and take any comments or questions anybody may have, either in the chat or speak up.
Yep, you're welcome to speak up. You're welcome to ask. We do want to hear what you have to say.
Nobody has any comments or questions? I got a million of them. Go ahead.
Does anybody discuss why the order or the connection, the smichut parshiot, between the laws?
Something it's clearly, I'm sure the answer is yes, but I can't speak to a specific place. I would say the following, and I don't remember where I saw this. I read this many years ago about this ABA,
Right.
Which is clear. But I presume that ABA, that is something about B that is related to A. It's not just coming out of nowhere. There's something about it that's related, but again, it requires a lot of thought about to figure out exactly what it is that is related.
Like, why in the middle would they be discussing the fire, burning the thing in the middle of the theft?
That's a good question. I'm saying, right, that's a very good question. I mean, one thing could be because it deals with the fire. If you read it about fire, then what you have over here is the distinction between somebody who's negligent and somebody who actually does something purposely, which actually is the theme that we encounter according to
Of the
reading.
shomer.
Exactly, right. The shomer. It's exactly the point. In other words, the case of the Kesef Okelim, this is my friend, but Zion Ovadia, he suggests the Kesef Okelim, you actually suspect the guy of stealing it. How did it disappear? Animals can walk off. The money's not walking off. And who would take it? You know what I mean? When it comes to the animals, we don't really suspect the guy of stealing an animal because he's going to get caught. What are you going to do with the animal? You got to feed the animal. Animal grazes. People will see it. The shomer is not going to steal an animal, but to steal it's a small object. You give him a little jewelry. You know what I mean? You put it in your pocket. And then so those are things that if we can't find the actual thief, the suspicion falls upon the shomer automatically. Little things, coins, diamonds, jewelry, those things are easily stolen. And we're never going to find it. So in that case, we really suspect the guy. In other words, the distinction between the case we don't suspect at all, maybe it was negligent, the case we suspect he actually took it. That could be related to this distinction we have in fire between the guy who actually sets a fire. He's not negligent. He actually he's a damager. To the guy for the fire kitetzayesh, he just so happens he wasn't careful, and maybe even burnt up his own property. Maybe his own stuff maybe starts in his own house. Maybe he also lost. You know what I mean? He didn't do it on purpose. On the other hand, the neighbor says to him, "You didn't do it on purpose, but at the end of the day, you caused me damage, and you are responsible for that. Now you have to pay the best, but you got to pay." But in the first case, there's a fine of paying the best. That I think is, to me, that's a very reasonable reading of the Chumash. It's always important to understand that the mainstream rabbinic tradition interpreted differently. They interpreted verse number 4 to refer to an animal that consumes, not the fire. But I'm just pointing out, when you read the Chumash, it doesn't seem to say that. The distinction that my friend is making here is what he calls criminal law versus tort. In other words, verses 6 and 7 talk about, is the guy a thief or not? It's not talking about how much he pays. In fact, if he's not a thief, he still has to pay. He has to pay, he has to restore. He doesn't pay double. If he's a thief, he pays double. The rabbinic tradition understood it differently. And then we have the big problem is verse number 8, actually, which will maybe next time we meet it after 2 weeks, maybe we'll deal with verse number 8. And then again, we have 3 more sessions. I'm adding on the 3 sessions. I feel we're really in the middle of something. We should do more. That's why I decided to add on the sessions, but we're not going to complete all of it either. But anyway, yeah, so I thought this was an interesting way to read these verses. I wanted to say over his Torah, and we'll be breaking now for a couple of weeks and wishing everybody a Chag Shavuot Sameach, Zman Matan Toratenu, and look forward to meeting again and to moving further in the discussion of these rules and laws. Then we'll figure where to go. We still have not discussed the Mishkan. I want to finish the book of Shemot with you. We haven't discussed the Mishkan, and we still have to go back to the golden calf, and there's more to be said. And then we have to look back at Breshit and Shemot together and to think more globally about these 2 books of the Torah and how they and how they work and how they put together, and what can be learned from the totality of the 2 books. That'll be an important review for us, and then we'll figure out how to move forward. Anyway, thanks all.
Great.
Thank you all again for participating.
And thank you. And I
Looking
just want to
forward
reiterate,
learning, with you some more. Thank you.
and I want to reiterate, this class will, instead of today being the final session, this class will pick up for 3 more sessions starting on June 15th. This class will meet at the same time as this at 10 a.m. Eastern on Sundays. And if you're already signed up for this session of the Book of the Covenant, you're automatically signed up for the next 3, and the same link you used today will work for those 3. Thank you for joining,
Thank
and
you
I
all.
hope to see you again soon.